What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Avowed, Obsidian's next title set in their fantasy IP of the World of Aora, or the Pillars of Eternity franchise if you're unfamiliar. This time, however, bringing what is classically a CRPG franchise into, of course, first and third person. Although, there's a reason this isn't called Pillars of Eternity 3, and rather Avowed, and we'll get into all that, but first, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Avowed, a few important things to go over. This video is going live just before the kickoff of the game's early access period. It has like a 5-day early access if you bought the more expensive version, and that is possible, of course, because I received a review key at the end of January, and what's more, back in November, I was invited out to Obsidian's headquarters in LA to preview the game, which I did in fact do, in large part down to my previous experience with the Pillars of Eternity franchise. I've covered both of those previous games pretty extensively, but with all of that said, I've got quite a bit to say about Avowed. Some good, some bad, but it's a game that covers a lot, and it's trying to do a lot, namely, reimagine the worlds of Pillars of Eternity, or Aora, as a place you can actually run through and explore and interact with all of its lore. And for the most part, I think they nailed that part. However, with the more action-oriented focus that this game has, I do think that certain parts of it, in particular, the fighter approach to the game, like, basic melee combat with a fighter-oriented skill tree, is a little underwhelming compared to the other options that are in the game, which makes the fact that this game leaves out options from the Pillars franchise especially noticeable. Now, I would hesitate to ever call what is not here from the Pillars franchise, like classes and things like that, missing, as I don't think they were ever planned or implemented to begin with, and in fact, some of that stuff not being here makes perfect narrative sense because its presence otherwise wouldn't have made any sense, such as being a cleric or a paladin. But things like a chanter or Cypher, unique classes to that world that were really interesting, not being here I do think is a bit of a bummer coming specifically from Pillars. But, of course, how much that bothers people who have never played that franchise was obviously going to be up for debate. Especially when you start looking at the wealth of different ways you can customize this game to be more approachable to you, which is where I want to jump into the technical state of this game. So, as you've likely already seen on screen by now, you can in fact play this in first or third person. That is an option you can toggle, and what's more, there's a host of UI stuff I want to get into in just a moment. But first and foremost, let's talk about the more negative stuff. So, broadly, I didn't really have any problems playing Avowed. If anything, it's quite polished, which isn't a huge surprise given that they have gone to great lengths to start working on handling things like bugs, etc., which we saw with the Outer Worlds. You can say many things about that game, but it launched in a very polished state, which is the same case for this game by and large, though obviously it's not perfect. Across about 110 hours with the title, I did experience one crash, and probably much more annoyingly actually, every time I would close the game and come back to it, like say the next day or whatever, it would actually rebind the key binds that I had already changed, so it would basically put them back to their default state. Hopefully that's the kind of thing that'll get fixed with a day one patch and you won't experience that for yourself, but it was certainly an annoyance on my end. But otherwise, I really didn't experience too many problems, and instead, there's actually a host of things I want to go over that this game does that I've seen people ask about over the last few months since the preview. So, as I mentioned, first and third person, that's there, but what's more, the heads-up display is very customizable. In fact, you can turn it off completely if you want to. The default option sees things like damage numbers popping up. Personally, I didn't like that, so I turned off the floating damage numbers, which you won't see much of in these videos outside of a few instances, just for, reference. If you don't like how loot glows or is outlined, you can change stuff like that in the settings and the menus. There's a field of view slider for first person. If anything, there is an impressive amount of accessibility options here, including things down to like UI and text scaling, which I think has a lot to do with Obsidian's dialogue system that they've really been expanding and fleshing out here and there, which we saw saw in, I believe, Pentiment, actually. So if you're concerned about any of that, a lot of it is extremely customizable. Now, before we move on, I will say that in third person, sometimes the animations could look a little wonky, especially if you started like really increasing your movement speed, which probably has something to do with the fact that basically every animation in third person is conformed to the sort of master set of animations, which are the first person versions. So everything that happens in third person has to fit the first person animation timings, which might account for why some of that is. But for the most part, ton of options, some minor stuff that I hope the day one patch fixes, like those key rebinds I mentioned. Otherwise, had a pretty great time with it, no issues. Though obviously with this being fully before launch and before everybody gets their hands on it with all sorts of different hardware, my own PC specs are in the About section of the channel, by the way, we shall see how it runs for everybody else. But for me, very smooth sailing. Which brings us to the difficulty of this game, and my own playthroughs actually. So I played this game a lot in the couple weeks of access that I had. In fact, I had time to do a full playthrough on normal difficulty in first person, which was my first one, and then I did a second full playthrough with a different background in third person on Path of the Damned, the hardest difficulty, followed by 3 very, very quick playthroughs on story difficulty just to run through and see the different story options presented to the different backgrounds you could pick. All of that basically just to give you a lot of different feedback about all the various options you might play through this game as. Now, otherwise, when it comes to difficulty, you have options from story through Path of the Damned. Much of what changes here is damage and health, yes, but health changes are relatively minimal. A lot of what this changes really is the damage done. And everything else it changes is more like enemy tactics. For instance, on Path of the Damned, enemies are much more aggressive, they tend to focus on you a lot more, and they put a lot of pressure on you, the player, to then of course react to all that in this more action-oriented system. Especially because on Path of the Damned, enemies can kill you pretty quickly, especially if they are higher level than you. In fact, the occasional one-shot was not unheard of if you're not somewhere you should be. Now, on the flip side of that, on story, pretty much as you would expect, everything dies very quickly and deals minimal damage to you, and tends to give you more breathing room, so that's certainly something to know. At least at launch here, there is no New Game Plus or anything like that to worry about. Which brings us to character creation. So, character creation in this game simultaneously has some really cool elements and some that I found really restricting. So in the world of Aora, or the Pillars universe, the Kith, or the civilized races that typically make up your playable races in the previous games, are your humans, elves, dwarves, Orlans, Amawa, and the godlike. Now, godlikes can be basically a sub-race of any of the other races. Our character in this game is always the godlike of an unknown deity. Basically what that means is that an unknown god of this universe blessed you while you were still in your mother's womb, and that's very relevant to the story, as you might imagine. In terms of what that means for us, we have fungal growths all over our face if you want them. You can turn those features off entirely and just look like a normal human or elf, because we cannot pick any of the more interesting races, like say Amawa or Orlans. This is supposed to be because of the fact that our character is a imperial envoy from the Adiran Empire. The Adiran Empire is primarily human and elf. So while you can't pick whatever race you want, with the options being pretty restricted there, you do have those godlike features, which are themselves restricted to a lot of different fungal abominations, let's say, that you can choose to either show or not. Now, if you turn those features off, your character is still a godlike and people will comment as such. You just, physically will look a little more normal for the sake of the people who want to see their character, say, in third person. After that, though, it's like a lot of other character creations. You'll start with a quick preset before moving on to sliders that allow you to customize exactly what your character looks like. This seemed pretty good to me, but I'm more into the RPG elements of this, and when it comes to RPG elements of character creation, there are 2 that we need to talk about. Your background and your starting attributes. So your background is by far the biggest, most important decision you're going to make in terms of story and narrative when it comes to creating your character. That's because each one of these backgrounds is, of course, who your character is and how they got recognized by the Emperor of Adir in order to become the Adiran envoy. As a result of this, each and every one of these backgrounds actually gives you different dialogue options and alternative options to some quests in terms of how you can resolve them. So as an example, War Hero here is going to let you get more dialogue options with not only one of your companions, Kai, but also an NPC, Inquisitor Ludwin, who is a returning character from the previous games as well. And those aren't options you get otherwise, so you can only really get those if you play as a War Hero. Whereas as a Court Augur, I also got quest options or quest resolutions in some cases that were only available as that particular character. So if you truly want to see everything this game's got going on, you'd have to play through it 5 times and explore some of these options. So even before we start talking about the story side of things, there's a fair bit of replayability here just based on that alone, if you've got the stomach for it. Next up, though, let's talk attributes. So the world of Eora has some really cool attributes in comparison to regular games. For instance, everybody has a might stat. Might is what increases your damage, as opposed to having to have like intellect on a wizard, that kind of thing. Intellect instead here will still make you better at spellcasting or just using abilities in general because it increases your maximum essence or your resource pool to use those abilities with. And you can of course see the rest of what they do on screen here, but by and large I'm a really big fan of this attribute system, which is also more or less what you see in the CRPGs as well. Though I will say, what is different here is that at character creation, they can be from 0 to 3, and they will be initially dispersed based on what your background was, though you can change them according to your own free will, mind you. What's more, during the game, they'll only get up to 15, instead of the more traditional TTRPG equivalents in the previous games. And what's more, even if you raise them past 15 with various methods to do that in-game, like gear and whatnot, you'll actually stop receiving benefits for them past 15 anyway, which means that's not really something you want to do. Now, what it doesn't tell you here is that you are going to have dialogue and related skill checks based on what these attributes are. So there are like might checks to intimidate or intellect checks to recall information, that kind of thing, in addition to your actual background dialogue choices. So that's another part of the story and dialogue that you'll only see based on what your choices here are. Though one of my complaints about the game actually is that a lot of those attribute-related checks are really low, and it's very possible to sort of min-max them if you know ahead of time what they are, mind you. Most people aren't going to experience that on a first playthrough, but I actually do wish they would have made it a little more difficult to hit some of those checks in a lot of conversation options, just to, make it a little more exclusive, given that it's already got a lot of replayability anyway. But that's a relatively minor gripe. So let's move on to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So right away, I don't want to spoil anything. It has some huge lore stuff for the world of Eora that I want to talk about later, but obviously not here in this review before the game is fully out. With that in mind, there may be some spoilers like contextually throughout the footage here, so certainly be aware of that, mind you. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk about the story setup and some general notes. Now, if you're having trouble following anything of what's going on in the game because of all the lore talking points you may not be aware of, the game does have an in-game glossary that will, show you what all this stuff means. And what's more, I myself actually put out a lore primer for this game like a week or so back, going over all of the important stuff you might want to know beforehand if you're interested. Otherwise, though, as I've already mentioned, our character is the Imperial Envoy of the Kingdom of Adir. We are being sent to a place called the Living Lands, which has been talked about but not previously shown in the CRPGs, meaning that this is a first look at a brand new area. We are going to the Living Lands to investigate a plague of the soul known as the Dream Scourge. In the world of Eora, souls are a very quantifiable thing in many ways. When people die, their souls get sucked into these large green pillars known as the Adra Pillars, or the Pillars of Eternity. Then they will go on into the beyond to hopefully await reincarnation into, of course, another life. Now, in the previous game, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, that cycle was disrupted. That does not really get addressed here because this is not Pillars 3, as you may notice by the title being Avowed. Just to get that out of the way. But nonetheless, the game does tackle a bunch of different stuff in relation to the world of Eora's overall lore and general state at the time this game takes place, which is about 3 years after the previous CRPG entry. But our job as an Imperial Envoy and the godlike of an unknown deity is to get to the bottom of this crisis in the living lands as the imperial envoy of a deer. And what happens to the living lands, as well as your status as envoy, is largely going to be up to you and the decisions you make, which is going to lead you to a large multitude of different endings. I would say there are 2 giant primary decisions, and then a whole host of smaller decisions that do everything I just talked about. So a pretty wide variety in terms of potential outcomes. And broadly speaking, as somebody who really enjoyed the previous games, I really enjoyed a lot of it. Some real, I would say, earth-shattering lore in there that I'm definitely going to go over in subsequent lore videos at some point, but obviously not here. Now, I do want to speak in more general terms about a few things, but first up, I will say that after my preview back in November, I actually made a lore speculation video talking about where I think they might take the story, and I did just want to mention that if you've watched that video, I was very close. But moving on a little bit, so without going into spoilers, but talking more generally about the quality of writing and things like that, I think they did a fantastic job, both in terms of representing what the world of Eora is, which is no surprise. The game director and many of the people working on the game, in fact, worked on the previous Pillars titles as well, and they do a great job of course, using that as a medium to explore all sorts of topics, such as second chances or colonialism, which has been, in and of itself, actually a running theme throughout all of the Pillars games and now Avowed. So if you enjoyed any of that, I don't think you'll be disappointed here, but a lot of the choices and things you'll see at play, I think, go into the depths of what both you as a player would be willing to accept, but also what your character is willing to accept in terms of what happens to the living lands, as well as the people around you, and that can be good or bad. If you want, you could absolutely do a sort of evil playthrough here, or simply a more pragmatic one. You could definitely stick to the role of your own character's role as an Imperial envoy representing that Empire's interests, and all of that is handled really well. And that's before you even start talking about the backgrounds, giving you different options based on who your character is meant to be. For instance, where one background might, favor simply being on the attack, even if you don't have to choose that option, another background might give you an option to, say, turn someone into a spy for you and acknowledge their own usefulness rather than simply discard them outright or just straight kill them. So I do think the game and the story does a fantastic job of putting choices at the center of what the game does and then paying those off later. Although I will say, sometimes the lack of immediacy to certain things can cause a little bit of friction. So to give a specific example there, you get introduced to a companion known as Marius really early, and he's going to accompany you throughout the entire game, but most of his characterization and, him opening up to you really doesn't happen until like the last couple hours of the game, depending on how you're playing. So you wind up with this companion that's basically a stick in the mud the whole time until suddenly he gets a whole bunch of lore and info dropped on him right at the ending. So as a result of that, it makes it really hard to connect with Marius at all until he finally gets his story, at least in that first playthrough. So there is stuff like that I think could have been handled better, but more than anything, I think in the context of Pillars of Eternity, while you may be disappointed at the lack of certain Pillars options, I think you'll likely be very satisfied with what they did with the world of it, because I think they really managed to capture the essence of what the world of Eora is here. Which brings us to the progression systems of the game. So this basically comes down to levels, attributes, gear, and items. Levels are pretty straightforward, as you might imagine. You kill things, you complete quests, you gain experience, this levels you up. As you level up, you will gain attribute points and skill points to spend on the game's skill trees. So attributes, as I mentioned, sort of cap out at 15, so no reason to take them higher through bonuses or anything. And while you'll initially get a lot of attribute points, they do start to slow down once you hit level 10. So you'll go from getting one every level to like every other level and then even longer later on. So as the game progresses, you get less and less attribute points, but you get more and more items to, say, pump up those attributes with. Now on the skill side of things, we can put our various skill points into one of 3 different skill trees: fighter, ranger, or wizard. Our companions have their own skills and upgrades associated with them that they will occasionally get skill points for as you level up. And then finally, there is a godlike tree. So the godlike tree is representative of your powers as a godlike. These are all connected to the story. There are passive ones that you can earn through reliving memories, or actual active abilities that can change depending on the choices you make throughout the game. So even there's going to be some difference in what is available to you. Now, in terms of the 3 main skill trees, outside of combat, the one thing I want to get across here is that the fighter tree feels very light in comparison to the other 2, because it's mostly passives and basic abilities. So, as an example, the fighter tree gets like a parry ability, and a lot of passive upgrades do certain types of damage with individual weapons, and then way later on they get like sort of spin attack called Clear Out. And compared to Ranger and Wizard, it's a bit of a letdown, frankly. So Ranger has things like, your standard slow and zoom as you're doing power attacks with a bow. It also has a bear summon. It lets you activate stealth outside of combat to help you get those sneak attacks in on enemies to facilitate a more ranged playstyle. Then you have the Wizard, who has probably the most amount of options overall just through the amount of spells that they can learn, both through grimoires, which are an accompanying system we'll talk about, but also the skills themselves you can unlock, which facilitates all sorts of gameplay and different combinations. Now, in theory, what you want to do here is mix and match, because you don't have to reach certain minimums in each tree. You could, as an example, only take the level 20 stuff from the fighter tree and then combine that with other stuff. But because the fighter tree is so light on what it actually includes ability-wise, it really only felt like it was the stat tree. I went there when I needed basic power-ups, but that's pretty much it, which was very underwhelming in comparison to the playstyle defining type stuff that I got from the other 2 trees. But luckily, that's not the only way to, of course, progress our character, because then we have gear. There's all sorts of gear to equip on our character, all sorts of armor slots. You don't get a head slot. That's actually a thing from the Pillars series. Godlikes are not typically able to wear helmets, and while you can turn those features off, some of the godlike features you can enable are giant and wild, and obviously you wouldn't be able to fit a helmet over that. And in the CRPGs, that's why the godlikes cannot actually wear helmets. Their heads are weird, basically. So if you're wondering about that, that is a holdover from that initial part of the series, because we are a godlike. And while you could make an exception for a case-by-case basis based on those features, obviously that's a difficult thing for a video game to do. Otherwise, though, we've got a trinket slot, ring slot, your main armor slot, as well as your weapons. You get 2 different weapon sets you can swap between, and boots and gloves. So appearance-wise, you can actually transmogrify your armor set. So if you want to look different, like in terms of gloves, boots, and your main armor, you can actually keep other sets of armor and transmog those looks. You can do that if you want to play in third person and look pretty snazzy all the time. But otherwise, your gear comes in different tiers while also having various effects. So stuff like rings, trinkets, gloves, boots, all that stuff will have unique effects that are not associated with a different tier of gear. Your weapons and your armor, though, have tiers associated with them, basically common through legendary or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is really important because the tier of the gear that you have on is going to determine how much damage you take or give to other individuals. So as an example of this, if you're fighting an enemy of a tier above you, they're going to take dramatically less damage than you can deal if you don't have that appropriate tier or matching tier of gear to actually fight them with. Now, enemies don't change this, they don't level up, they simply are the tier that they are at when you meet them, so it is possible to sort of just get better gear and come back and annihilate them, so there's no level scaling to speak of otherwise. Now, you can upgrade all of your various gear, though you'll probably want to mostly stick to uniques because basic gear can only be upgraded up to tier 4, or superb. Uniques can be upgraded to legendary status, taking them even farther, and given that they also all have unique looks, there's that too. Now, these upgrades are mostly facilitated through your camp at your sort of workstation, but in order to upgrade anything, you need a whole bunch of materials from the environment, which is itself, unsurprisingly, divided into tiers based on the region you're in. But in order to upgrade the best stuff, you need more of those materials, basically special sort of upgrade materials like various types of Adra, to go from one tier to the next. But your unique weapons specifically can also be enchanted, as they call it, which is another feature from the Pillars series. But basically, every unique weapon you have will have some sort of unique effect, as you might expect. And at the enchanting table, you'll be able to spend various upgrade materials on one of 2 different upgrade paths for that special effect, which can change, of course, how it functions, thus changing how useful that particular item is to you. These unique effects produced through that enchanting are on one hand a little less than the enchanting in the CRPGs, which tended to be a little more expansive as opposed to an either-or option, but it's still a pretty cool system overall, I think, as it lets you vary up how all of that stuff works. Now, all the gear you're not using can be broken down into its constituent parts, which makes getting upgrade components easier for other gear, such as the Audra, for instance. If you break down uniques that you're not using, you'll get those Audra materials to upgrade other stuff with, which can help you move through the ranks quickly, especially on Path of the Damned difficulty. And then, last but not least, for progression, we have the totems. So each region has a totem associated with it, and you'll be able to pick up the base and find pieces of that totem in a given area. So once you have those, you can set them up in your camp, and once you do, you can activate the buffs associated with that totem, which are very large buffs to combat, basically, and some of your attributes. So while I wouldn't say they're explicitly necessary, they can be substantial buffs to your playstyle if you can piece them all together. Though, of course, you can only have one totem activated at a time. But all of that, of course, brings us to the gameplay and world section. So, Avowed here uses several explorable sort of hub areas or zones. These are fairly large. In fact, I would say some of them, if fully explored, are larger than what we saw in the Outer Worlds, which was comparable in terms of its overall structure, that is to say several explorable zones. Now, while you do have to advance the story to go from one zone to the next, once that's done, you can freely go back to any of the zones you've been in previously to explore more or, complete quests or do whatever your heart desires. But a couple of things I want to get into straight away. For starters, each zone is absolutely packed with stuff to do and things to find. So there's plenty of quests and things that you might expect, but really exploration and seeing this world in a manner in which you can, fully explore it as opposed to the top-down look of the CRPGs is really something. Especially since the Living Lands, as the name might subtly imply, is meant to be overgrown and lush and crazy. There are several different biomes within very nearby distance to each other, which doesn't make a ton of sense, but that's the point. The Living Lands are supposed to be this overgrown, crazy, dramatic landscape types of place, and they even sort of fed into the story with that about the why. And I mention that specifically because I've seen people talk about the sort of oversaturated, vibrant colors. That is actually very lore accurate to what this place is supposed to be. What's more, though, they had the opportunity to take that even farther and follow up on lore entries about what the Living Lands is and what went on here, such as the Society of the Godless, a group of people who is known not to have followed the main pantheon of deities in this universe, or seemingly any at all, which is of course why they're called the Godless, but you can find their ruins everywhere, you can explore all of that stuff. It even connects a little bit to a previous sort of lore teaser in the CRPGs about a continent called Yezua. So not only are these zones packed and filled to the brim with all sorts of lore and, things to see, they're also very vertical. This game is really good about letting you climb basically everything you see. And while you can't freely go absolutely everywhere, you'd be surprised how often, if you are determined enough, you can find various ways to climb up all sorts of structures, only to be rewarded with various materials or weapons or upgrades or, anything else for your effort. So this entire section feels really rewarding to explore, both literally in terms of the rewards you're getting and what you're seeing, but also from a lore perspective because you'll get the opportunity to learn more about the world, especially when you're doing side quests and the like. One of the first side quests you'll run into, for example, explores the concepts of soul twins, which is something that can go wrong with the cycle of reincarnation that is inherent to this world. And you'll see little stuff like that that's really interesting all throughout the game. And to make it even better, if you were to merely go around exploring the main points of interest and not talking to anybody or following up with anyone, you would actually not be seeing everything. There's so much here that is unmarked or unmentioned that you can discover for yourself. One of the easiest examples of this is actually with completing quests. Sometimes when you do a quest, it will complete without ever directing you back to, say, a big plot character for that quest. But if you go back and talk to that character, you'll often be rewarded with dialogue or interesting outcomes. And that's especially interesting when you get later into the game, when you can potentially go back and revisit areas you previously were and talk to NPCs who may have something very interesting to say about your current goings-on. So if you actually take the time time to explore and watch how the world changes and evolves around you, it really is actually pretty interesting to see. But in that exact same vein, it does have its limits. This is not something like the Outer Worlds, actually, where you can just go crazy and kill everybody you meet. The game simply will not let you do that. Now, I don't necessarily mind that. I think the other content that is here is worth, not being a full-blown murder hobo, and what's more, you do usually get your chance to be a murder hobo and kill important characters, etc. when the time is right. You just won't necessarily be able to do it right away. Then we have our companions and our camp. So we will find campsites all throughout these zones, usually marked by an Audra pillar, and we can set up and rest here or fast travel and do the same. Now, camps primarily serve as a point to talk to your companions when they want to have a conversation, but also to upgrade your gear that we mentioned earlier. And naturally, you can also rest and recover your health and the like here, and even cook up various food. Now, you'll find all sorts of ingredients while you're out exploring. You can bring that back to your campsite and cook it into various meals, which can give you all sorts of useful buffs, not unlike the CRPG in that regard. This is also going to help you alleviate your potions usage, as you can restore health and essence in combat via potions much more quickly, but you can also eat food in combat to restore it slowly. But outside of combat, that's actually increased, and food is a great way to recover health. That way you're not burning through all your potions every 5 seconds. But as far as our companions go, we've got Kai, Marius, Giada, and Yatsley. Of these 4, I will straight away say that Kai and Yatsley are definitely the most interesting of the bunch, though technically speaking, there are 2 other sort of temporary companions that you can get for a short while, but for the most part, it's just these 4. Now, I would say Kai's the best overall. He is a deserter from the Rawatayan Navy who came to the Living Lands for a second chance, and you meet him pretty much the second you get out of the tutorial area. You follow on from this by Marius. I didn't honestly care for Marius too much. Most of his characterization came so late in the game that I'd already kind of dealt with everybody else and was having more fun with them at that point, but his story does get pretty good. It just takes a while to get where it's going. He is our dwarven tracker, which means he does great range damage, whereas Kai is our tank, primarily, just absorbing all the hits from everybody else as opposed to damage. Eventually, you'll get Giada. Giada is a decent character overall. She's an animancer, that is to say she studies the manipulation of souls, and she's trying to carry on the legacy of her parents, who were also in the Living Lands doing various studies before an accident befell them. But with their study of souls, she obviously is going to help you study the Dream Scourge and figure it out. And then lastly, we have Yatsley, who is self-described as a firecracker, which is more or less correct. She is an Orlan, and where Giada does sort of magical support, Yatsley is all about magical damage. Now, just because I assume somebody will ask, you cannot romance any of these characters. There is no romance really in the game, at least, currently. And personally, that's fine with me. I don't really care for romances in video games. It's kind of meaningless to me one way or the other. But obviously, as an important factor that some people play these games for, just worth a mention that it's not going to be a possibility. So you're pretty much just kind of dealing with who these characters are and their own personal stories and how they tie in with you. They are not really optional. You can give them directions in combat. You'll have up to 2 of them with you at a time, and they're going to be very helpful in that way. Now, while they won't leave you over the course of normal gameplay, there will come a point in the story where you can potentially lose all of them, and they also serve as a sort of explainer for a lot of the world that's happening around you. They'll have things to say about basically everything in every zone, and in fact, if you take some of them back to previous zones from before you got them, they may even have extra stuff to say to certain people you've already met, which I thought was interesting. For example, you could take Giada back to Dawnshore, and she has a lot to say to the Endearan ambassador as an example. But with that, I think you kind of get the gist as far as companions go. So all in all, when it comes to, exploring, questing, all that stuff, with trying to keep spoilers to a minimum, I will say that I enjoyed it. I appreciated that they weren't trying to make some over-the-top large open world. I think we see a lot of that these days, and sometimes it simply isn't necessary, especially given the story that they were trying to tell here. So obviously that may or may not land for everyone, but I think they did a good job with it. I will say personally, my favorite area wound up being Shatterscarp, which is the 3rd area you'll find yourself in, which happens to be a large sort of desert, rocky crag type of place, which I thought was pretty cool. But as a point of criticism, you will find yourself fighting a lot of the same enemies, especially if you are actually exploring everything. Because while there is a decent amount of enemy variety, the bulk of what you wind up fighting still manages to be Zarups and the undead most of the time. Otherwise, each zone has like 1 or 2 staple enemies, but seriously, there are so many Zarups. All of that, though, brings us to the combat section. So the combat of this game is especially interesting, naturally, because of the switch from an isometric CRPG to, of course, a first or third person action-oriented system. So a lot going on there. As I already mentioned much earlier, some of the stuff from the Pillars franchise simply is not here. For instance, you can't be a shape-shifting druid, or a paladin, or a cleric, and like I mentioned earlier, some of that is for story reasons. Other stuff, though, like the Cypher or the Chanter, I really don't see much of a reason why they couldn't have included it, other than, of course, things like scope, etc., and I'm not sure how much people will enjoy that answer, let's say, given that Obsidian is owned by Microsoft these days. But given that I don't expect the audience for Avowed here to necessarily be 1-1 with the audience for Pillars, hard to say how much that'll bother anybody else. Now, what is available, however, is more unique ways to play and combine this stuff than you might expect. For instance, while there is only one summon via the skill trees, there are actually a lot of items that will summon things as well. So if you set everything up properly, you can absolutely run a sort of little mini summoner build. You can obviously do things like play a sort of battle mage, or even the stealth archer as you might expect, or a stealth assassin, that kind of thing. And depending on how much you're willing to experiment with these systems, you can do a surprising amount with them. But to get some of the more basic stuff out of the way, as I mentioned, there are 2 weapon sets that we can swap between whenever, though it obviously does take a second to do so, and then we can equip each hand. Some stuff can only go in the offhand, like a grimoire or a shield, but otherwise you can dual wield, you can use 2-handers, and there's a good amount of weapon variety with things like spears, bows, pistols, arquebuses, etc. So all of that combined with unique weapons and their unique enchantments means there are a variety of ways to play this game, but I will say straight away that for me, just a straight up melee character is probably the most boring way to do it, because that tree is just so devoid of interesting things in comparison to ranger or wizard. So if you just want to play a straight fighter, it's honestly not a really rewarding experience. And I know there were some concerns about things like melee combat feeling like it lacked impact and all that, but as I saw in my preview recently in November, and hopefully people will see for themselves when they play, I actually don't think that's nearly as much of an issue as it initially seemed, because I do think combat feels quite good in a way that actually doesn't even translate to the screen super well, so hopefully it comes across in video, but not necessarily. I actually found myself with a slightly different problem, simply being that I wish the actual melee combat was a little more compelling with various abilities to activate and stuff, because while you can of course block and get a parry, it's mostly just like passives otherwise, which was boring, honestly. So if you're gonna go that route, definitely combine it with other stuff from the other trees to make it more interesting. But let's talk about those other trees. So Ranger is super fun, mostly because, you have your obvious things like a bow, but you also get options like pistols and arquebuses, which all come with their own unique effects if you're using unique weapons. And dual wielding pistols, as an example, you can sort of get into a flow with the reload times on each one, so you're kind of constantly shooting a weapon as the other one comes back up, and that's discounting weaving abilities in between them. For instance, I got a unique pistol really early on called Karok's Pride, which I upgraded to have a 25% chance when it kills someone to launch an electric bolt that bounces between enemies, and I caused a lot of mayhem with that one. But then I combined that setup with, summoning a bear and throwing the occasional spell as an example. So that was pretty cool. Now you can play a sneaky sort of character by default, but the Ranger is actually also where you're going to get a lot of the skills that are going to facilitate a sort of stealth-oriented playthrough at the same time, like the ability called Shadowing Beyond, which will effectively turn you invisible for a little while, which will help you break combat in order to perform another sneak attack, as you can often perform stealth attacks to start combat, but it can be difficult to play that way, like from start to finish, simply because sometimes your sneak attacks won't necessarily kill the enemy, which will then trigger, of course, everyone around. And what's more, if you sneak attack an enemy, within range of other enemies, they will either see or hear you. So basically, if you want to play a completely stealth character, you're going to have to commit. But best of all, in my opinion, was really all of the stuff in the mage tree. So the mage tree is fantastic because of all the spells you can cast, but also because of the grimoire system. So the grimoire system was actually from the CRPGs as well, which has a slightly lesser form here. Basically, there are all sorts of grimoire-style weapons you can pick up. They equip to your offhand, and you can use them to cast spells that your character otherwise does not know. And then when you meet the level requirements and you have that grimoire, you can actually go in and learn the spells from that grimoire to cast when you aren't using it. This is going to let you utilize spells that you otherwise would have to use a grimoire for. What's more is if you have the spell in your grimoire but also have invested skill points into it, you can cast an upgraded version of it. Now, in order to commit to this, which you're going to need to do, you'll have to put points into Grimoire Mastery, which will let you access the higher tiers of spells with a given grimoire, thus learning them and, using them. But there are so many ways to combine these spells with stuff from the other trees that it's just the best way to play, in my opinion. It really feels like the wizard tree in particular just has so much more going on than the other two. Though do keep in mind all of this can be freely swapped between, and in combination with your gear, I think it is extremely likely you'll be able to find a playstyle you like if you try hard enough, but your enjoyment is largely going to come down to that. Do you A, understand the system enough to gear up properly and not be decimated by enemies who are several tiers higher than you because you lack the gear? And then can you combine that gear in amusing ways to give yourself a playstyle you enjoy that represents the character you're trying to make? And I think they've done that in a fun way that feels pretty natural, but obviously the general consensus is still out until it gets into people's hands. But for me, I enjoyed it a lot. Even if I do wish there were some options from the Pillars series here to mess around with, I still think they did a good job with this. It's pretty fun. And being able to explore that in a game that takes choice and consequence seriously, lets you roleplay the character you want to play, it was a pretty great experience overall. But that does bring us to the Steam Deck section. So the Steam Deck, I was very interested to see how it would play this. So back in November, during that preview, I got the chance to interview the devs, of course, and I got to ask Carrie Patel about, were they optimizing for any handhelds, not just the Steam Deck, and the answer there was no. So they are not specifically tailoring anything to the Steam Deck, but it's a pretty versatile piece of hardware, so that doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't work. And I will say that this game will run on the Steam Deck, and it runs well enough for it to be playable, but I do think playable is the rating it will probably get. Now, it does have everything you would want, cloud saves, controller support, but what's more, the built-in UI options, like scaling all the UI, the accessibility stuff, means that you can really change whatever you want to make that a more enjoyable experience. But the problem does come with the fact that even on the lowest settings, I was getting a pretty choppy frame rate. Like, it's definitely playable, don't get me wrong, but I think like 20 to 25 FPS seemed to be where you could expect it to be most of the time. And simply because of that, it obviously wasn't nearly as smooth of an experience as it was on my PC, but like if you don't have any other hardware to play this on, yes, you could play it on the Steam Deck. Now, obviously, I don't know if they'll go through the hassle of optimizing it for that platform, but I think if the game does well enough and they take the time to do it, it would likely be a really good experience there because it's so close to being good. But it's clear some adjustments would have to be made so it could handle the game a little better so you'd get a better frame rate. If you're willing to put up with that, it's definitely doable though. All of that, however, brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side for me were the choice and consequences, being able to lay things out and then pick a side in any given conflict and then see the results of that and how it winds up affecting both the living lands, the world at large, and the wider lore of the Pillars of Eternity universe. There's some pretty big stuff there that we're going to talk about later. And what's more though, seeing a place from the world of Eora, which I really love, in a way that sees it fully explorable and realized is really cool. I think they did a great job of making the world explorable and making that exploration rewarding while at the same time diving into the various topics that are often associated with the series itself. It really is tremendous stuff, and I think especially if you want to replay it multiple times to see all those options, it can be a fantastic experience. But nonetheless, some negatives. Right away, the biggest one for me was just melee combat really doesn't have a lot going on in comparison to other stuff. And I think the obvious expectation there was that you would mix and match it with the other two to make it feel better. But for people who want to play a straight up fighter, I don't think you're going to have a good time with that probably because there's just not much there. And then you have the stuff that isn't here from the Pillars series. So in some cases, again, story reasons, it wouldn't make any sense. But stuff like the Cypher and the Chanter, I just don't really see a reason that couldn't have been in here. And as someone who's coming from the Pillars series, that's a disappointment to me. Now, I would hesitate to call it missing because, again, I don't think it was ever planned to be in here to begin with. But to be very frank with you, I think we've seen universes and franchises make this genre shift before. And something that tends to come with that sort of genre shift is a trimming down of features and things that make those games interesting. interesting. And I worry then that that's the direction that the Pillars series would go. And well, given that Pillars 3 is unlikely if this game especially doesn't do well, but also since Pillars 2 is pretty widely known to not have sold particularly well off the bat, it eventually made a profit and did better, but it took a while to get to that point, and that's obviously not something that a studio may want to invest its time with if it's looking for a return. And while I'm personally happy to see the series get bigger and potentially in the hands of more people who may enjoy it, I do at the same time worry about those features being stripped away over time and, the games becoming less as a result of that. So again, whether or not that bothers anybody else, we'll see. But I think not seeing that stuff here for myself was a bummer for sure. Beyond those two bigger gripes, though, just a handful of little nitpick stuff. Like, for instance, you can't drop a pin on the map as an example, and, there's a lot of stuff to explore on a given map, so that would have been handy to mark things for myself. Not a big deal, but, a tiny thing that would have made a difference to me. Or the fact that I have to go to the camp in order to actually upgrade or enchant things. It would have been nice to be able to do that just straight up in town, as opposed to having to go to camp specifically for that. I think just having to go to town would have been good enough. But all in all, that brings me to my conclusion. I would say that there are certainly some areas that I think Avowed could improve. The combat, like I mentioned, the fighter skill tree, like I mentioned, those smaller nitpicky things, stuff like that. But by and large, I had a great time with Avowed. It's very replayable. I went through it several times to see all the different options and stuff, and I think in that respect, it's well worth your time if that's what you're looking for. If you're coming from the Pillars series, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how much this really captures the essence of the world of Eora. I know I loved that part more than anything else. So while the genre shift here obviously comes with a few growing pains, I think, especially if this does well and they wind up keeping up with the post-launch support and really fleshing some of this stuff out, then it'll be a great time. And for all of those reasons together, the game gets a buy out of me. It is $70 right now over on Steam for the base game. The premium edition's $90, which comes with the 5 days early access and some skins and stuff, which I don't love, but also the art book and the soundtrack if you're into that. And what's more, if you don't love the price, as I get it, honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the $70 price tag everybody's trying to push, but if that's an issue for you, the game is, of course, also on Game Pass, and given how much cheaper that will be, I imagine that's where a lot of people are going to wind up playing this one, where hopefully you'll get to enjoy the world of Eora and see a universe that I'm really fond of. In any event, I think that's pretty much going to do it for this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down below. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.